Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Co-Chair McGovern and members of the Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the history and the context of human rights violations in Kashmir. Today is the 103rd day of siege in Kashmir. On August 5th, the government of India revoked constitutional provisions granting provisional autonomy to the state of Jammu and Kashmir and announced the creation of two separate federally administered union territories, which came into effect on October 31st. Kashmir scholars argue that these unilateral actions constitute the third stage in India's longstanding occupation of Kashmir. The first stage began when the Maharaja of the princely state signed the Instrument of Accession in 1947 as a temporary legal and political arrangement born of necessity during war, decolonization, and partition on the subcontinent. The UN Security Council issued a series of resolutions acknowledging the provisional nature of the accession and establishing that Kashmir's political future would be determined through a plebiscite. In writing the Constitution of the new nation, India's Constituent Assembly included Article 370 to incorporate the conditional and provisional accession into the Constitution. The second stage of Indian occupation of Kashmir began in the late 1980s as Kashmiris launched a popular armed rebellion against the Indian state. India sought to crush the rebellion through a massive counterinsurgency assault against armed and civilian populations, deploying more than 700,000 state-armed forces in the region. Although the armed rebellion faded by the late 1990s, India's counterinsurgency regime has remained in place. International human rights bodies have condemned extrajudicial killings, illegal detentions, torture, sexual violence, forced labor, disappearance, and mass graves across the last 3 decades. The third stage of Indian occupation of Kashmir began on August 5, 2019. The Indian government's unilateral abrogation of J&K's special status is in serious violation of past UN Security Council resolutions regarding the Kashmiri right to self-determination, and it irreversibly erases the limited legal recognition and protection of self-governance, legal autonomy, and citizenship rights for Kashmiris. Such maneuvers signal an intention to carry out far-reaching changes to demographic and landholding patterns by opening up Kashmir to settlement by outsiders who were previously restricted from purchasing land in the region. To carry out these massive legal and political transformations, the government of India has imposed extremely restrictive measures through the current siege. And the testimony today is based on credible media sources, as well as 6 fact-finding reports written by highly respected Indian civil society groups. During the siege, we have seen widespread violations of rights to life, liberty, and the security of persons. The government of India claims that more than 3,800 people have been detained since August 5th and that 2,600 of them have been released. The fact-finding reports indicate that the number of detentions is in fact higher than 10,000. In a recent interview, the leading Kashmiri civil liberties lawyer Parvez Imroz reported that as many as 20 to 30,000 detentions have occurred primarily of juveniles. Many of these are illegal, undocumented, and incommunicado detentions, which have a disappearance effect, as family members are unable to ascertain the whereabouts of detainees. Credible sources have reported allegations of torture by armed security personnel, including broadcasting sounds of beatings and pleas for mercy over loudspeakers for the purpose of terrorizing the population. We've also seen failures of the administration of justice, access to justice, and the rule of law. This includes the targeting of the legal community, the non-functioning of the J&K High Court, and the delay of habeas corpus petitions and the lack of due process at the High Court and the Supreme Court of India. I'd like to say a few words about minority communities in the region. There are several ethnic and religious minorities in Indian-administered Kashmir. The recent legal maneuvers impact all indigenous residents, including majority and minority ethnic and religious groups living in J&K and those who have migrated out of J&K. In Kashmir Valley, the most significant religious minority groups are Kashmiri Hindus or Pundits and Sikhs. These minority communities, and especially Kashmiri Pundits, have experienced heightened fear and vulnerability through war and conflict. During the last 3 decades, members of the minority Pundit community, as well as the majority Muslim community, have left Kashmir in large numbers, escaping violence and insecurity. The size of the Kashmiri Pundit community shrank from an estimated 140,000 in the late 80s to an estimated 20,000 by 1998. Scholars estimate on the basis of census data and demographic figures that 155,000 to 170,000 Kashmiri Pundits left the valley after the onset of violence in 1989. Several thousand Kashmiri Pundits have continued to live in Kashmir harmoniously with their Muslim friends and neighbors. There's never been a full and impartial accounting of what actually caused many Pundits to leave Kashmir. The scholarship shows that their departure was prompted by fear and vulnerability produced through the deterioration of the law and order situation. It's also true that serious crimes occurred against Kashmiri minority communities, including Kashmiri Pundits, in the 90s, and that these crimes have never been properly investigated or redressed, resulting in impunity and a lack of closure for victims. The Indian state, which is responsible for the security of civilians and property, utterly failed to protect Kashmiri Pundits' internationally recognized rights as minorities and victims of and refugees from an armed conflict. It is imperative to investigate all crimes against Kashmiri Pundits through an international inquiry, since Indian criminal justice processes have failed. It's also imperative that the pain and suffering of any Kashmiri community should not be instrumentalized, manipulated, or weaponized as a claim against other communities. As state subjects and as persons displaced by the conflict, Kashmiri Pundits have legal and political stakes in the future of Kashmir. The international resolution of the Kashmir dispute requires justice, truth, and a democratic and peaceful solution in keeping with international law for all Kashmiris. There's a human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding in Kashmir, and the United States must take notice. Kashmir scholars have identified a series of recommendations for action on behalf of the people of Indian-administered Kashmir. These are included in my written testimony. We urge you to leverage your positions in the U.S. and internationally to ensure the implementation of these recommendations. And we also urge members of Congress to support a resolution calling for an end to the siege and for diplomatic support for a pathway leading to the resolution of the international dispute in accordance with the wishes of Kashmiri communities. Thank you.
Thank you.